Welcome back to Getting Lost with myself, Gooder, and my good friend
Dan, who is continuing to be lost.
So we're on to episode 14, special. So this is mostly, or sort of largely, essentially about Michael and Walt.
Yeah. A good episode, I thought, this one. Much better than the previous episode, or at least more consistent than the previous episode.
Much less Boone, which is always a good start.
Yeah.
So I think starting off with the flashbacks, what I like about the flashbacks is it really shows you how strongly Michael does actually feel about Walt, and gives you that reasoning of why he's not been like in Walt's life.
It's interesting you said like it shows how strongly he feels about Walt, but at the same time, I'm not convinced it necessarily does, but it explains a huge amount. So the thing that got me about the flashbacks is to recap, we learned that
there's a happy relationship with Michael and Walt's mother.
Yeah. And that's the bit that was a very happy relationship, or at least from Michael's side was a very happy relationship. He's really happy to be having a son, but he barely, has any time with him. And that's I think the bit that's kind of interesting and kind of trying to get around in my head, because there's clearly a big gap when the mother, it's Susan, moves to Amsterdam and then ultimately to Australia, where the assumption or the sort of implying this is that Michael doesn't see her or Walt for many, many years. Period.
I think it's interesting, is it? Because I think you get the impression that Michael really likes or really does feel strongly, for his son, but his relationship with the mother just kind of breaks down so badly in the end.
Yeah, and I really didn't know what to make of Susan. This was the thing that got me, because they seem to have a very good relationship, which has clearly somewhat fallen down. And to the extent that she goes off and has a relationship with someone else entirely. And it felt a little, I felt like it was a reasonable grievance on Michael's part, where it's like, hold on, what? You've married the guy who you've gone off and accepted the job. Yeah. It's like, it seems like a little bit suspicious, which seems fair enough. But yet, when she comes back, when Michael's injured himself, again, there seems to be, a good relationship. It's not like they're at each other's throats or anything like that. And
I think it's one of the, I guess it's kind of comes somewhat down to that, the way that the flashbacks are used, and that there are big time gaps.
Yeah.
This week between each of the flashbacks, in terms of the passage of time between what we see. Because we first see them like shopping for a crib.
Yeah.
And then we next see them where Walt appears to be maybe like one or two.
Yeah. So
and that's when they're having the conversation about Susan moving overseas for work. And at that point, clearly the relationship has started to kind of break down.
And they sort of mention, we've talked about having some time apart.
Yeah.
So it's an acknowledged problem.
And then I think the next flashback you get is when Michael's calling them and he can hear what was his name? Brian, I think,
yeah,
in the background. So he gets angry. So that's kind of the next step, I think, in the breakdown of the relationship.
And then he gets hit by the
car, which obviously keeps him from flying out.
Yeah. But I think what got me was the fact that, okay, he's had to have a year rehab, but then I think we assume 8-10 years have passed, given the age Walt has developed in that space of time.
That much bigger.
And it's heavily implied, because he doesn't even recognize who Brian is, that he's clearly never gone to see them in that space of time.
Yeah, he's never met Brian.
Yeah. and that sort of big gap, you sort of go, well, why has he not reached out apart from the letters type stuff?
Well, I was going to say that's the other factor, isn't it? In that he has been writing to Walt, but Walt's mother has never handed these letters to Walt.
So the underlying assumption is that something else must have gone on in terms of presumably Susan's sort of said, you can't see him, we don't want to confuse the kid, all the other bits and pieces.
I can imagine there being a big argument over, because it's mentioned, isn't it, that Brian has adopted Walt.
Yeah.
So I can imagine there being a big breakdown between Michael and Susan over that, and Michael not wanting like Brian to be an adoptive father, like officially, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So there was bits and pieces that I just didn't quite know how to view the characters. So like I couldn't really decide. Like Susan, who's portrayed by an actress who I've seen in other things, just came across as just a genuinely nice person throughout the whole thing. But at the same time, you kind of felt for Michael a lot. And the only way you feel for Michael a lot is if Susan's not being a particularly nice person. So
I think the problem with the character of Susan is that character almost is very much there as a plot device. She's there to motivate Michael and create that divide between him and Walt. And she doesn't really, you can't really get a handle on her as a person, because she just does what she needs to do to set up what needs to be set up.
Yeah, and that's probably it. And that's why I sort of struggled to get a handle on her characterization, because if she's just, as you say, she's just there, or she's just used to go, right, okay, we need Michael to have a kid, so we need...
Yeah, like, here's the mother takes kid away, mother dies.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the issue of it. But there's some interesting things about it. So now that we've discovered, okay, there is this huge gap, which makes sense now. We didn't have that context before in terms of Michael and Walt. Not, the assumption that you had was that this is Michael's son, and they'd been father and son for a long period of time. And now you go, oh, okay, this explains.
I think where you're at the moment, or where you're at, is perhaps the idea that I think initially that Walt might be a son that Michael's never met, because that they've not really met before he's gone to pick him up from Australia. So you're kind of thinking, or is it like, somebody like a child he's fathered and they're not met? But now we know that he does initially know Walt anyway before this big gap.
Yeah, and it puts that into context. It puts their relationship into context in that, and the B plot side of things on the island sort of really sort of hammers that home, where I think there's a line that Locke says, I treat him like an adult, you treat him like a kid. But then Michael's never had an opportunity to, interact with him as a kid. So it makes sense that that's going to be the way of doing it. And he hasn't had a chance. Neither of them have any chance to have any kind of trust in each other.
Yeah.
It's just purely, I'm the father, do I say? And Walt doesn't even recognize him as his father until the day before the plane crash. So it kind of makes sense that there's this big, divide between them. And it's kind of nice that, the whole letter thing brings them close, and the weird polar bear attack sort of brings them closer. Which again sort of comes into that theme of the island sort of presenting opportunities for people to solve their problems or get redemption. And in this case, it seems it's the son that I never got to be the father for. And this sort of sets that element up quite well.
And we do get, I think, some more, or at least some hints at some more paranormal stuff elsewhere in the world. Yeah, sequence where Walt is reading the book about the birds.
Yeah, and then the bird crashed
upset that nobody's paying attention to him, and then a bird hits the window and it freaks out.
Yeah, and the bits around that are sort of I thought was interesting. So we've had the comic producing the polar bear potentially before, and we obviously get that again this episode, and we have the potential Walt reading the book produces the bird. But then you've got some, and those are fairly clear in terms of this is what we're hinting, that there's something special about Walt and he's potentially the one generating these weird events. But then you've got an undercurrent of, is there something more nefarious or darker going on here? Because the Susan dying very quickly from an unspecified blood disorder is one thing. And then you've got Brian basically seemingly massively scared of him.
Yeah.
In terms of trying to get rid of him as soon.
There's a bit of a Damien thing going on.
Yeah. And you kind of go, ooh. And it's less, that this one isn't telegraphed as prominently as those other two things, but it's definitely there that, he's the one who says, he's special, things happen around him, strongly implying that, the bird thing is not the only thing that's happened, and presumably,
it's like the show where, like, earlier in the season, these kind of things were happening, but they were kind of either giving you kind of possible other explanations or not, like acknowledging them as being kind of anything but chance or something. Whereas now we've specifically got the character saying, there's something weird going on here.
Yeah, there's something weird about Walt. And I'm not quite sure how much time is supposed to have passed since Susan dies and Brian immediately getting rid of Walt.
Yeah, I think it's implied that it's pretty...
It certainly seems very, very quick.
And Brian is another additive, or another added to the list of arsehole secondary character, or not even secondary, but like third tier characters who are... Because immediately he's like, I only signed the adoption papers because I wanted Susan and I don't give a shit about Walt.
And it's this interesting sort of comparison in that, if you compare him to Michael effectively would happily have kept Walt when that's what it's like the two sides, the two different sides of the coin. There's Brian who wanted just Susan and Michael who effectively wanted just Walt. Yeah. And
I guess we're coming back again, aren't we? A bit of a running theme of fathers and sons.
Yeah. And speaking of running themes, this is again an interesting one in terms of why they end up on the plane, because it's Brian who's bought the tickets in this case. It's for Michael. It's like, here's the ticket to Sydney, and here's the 2 tickets coming back. So you're on that plane with Walt. Yeah, well, this is definitely one where the characters are on the plane as a result of a third party putting them on that plane. And there's an interesting thing that was sort of rolling around in my head about the dog Vincent. Like, there seems to be something odd about the dog Vincent as well, because
I do like the fact that like Michael just basically steals Vincent. That's brilliant.
Yeah, it's like it's Brian's dog. It's like not anymore. He said we could have him.
I just love that moment where like Walt says it's Brian's dog, and then there's like a moment where Michael doesn't say anything, and he can tell he's thinking Brian's a dick. Let's just take the dog.
Yeah. But I think the other thing that I thought was interesting was about that, because it is that scene where he steals the dog, is the fact that Walt calls Brian.
Yeah.
He doesn't call him dad or father, and he doesn't like react like crazily to the notion that Michael is his actual dad. So again, you kind of think, what's gone on in like that 8-year span or whatever it was?
Yeah, how much does Walt?
So yeah, that whole thing I think was interesting, because I'm now suspicious of Vincent, and like, is Vincent really Vincent? Because it was fairly surprising that he survived in the first place, and then just appears, because he clearly must have been in the hold. And he's the first thing that Jack saw on the island, wasn't he? So
yeah, actually, yeah, it's a good question to ask, because the Vincent go, like, when the bear appears, Vincent's gone. So it's like, is it a question of whatever is going on? Like, Vincent can't be there if there's another.
Yeah, there's definitely something. You know, in my mind, there's a potential like interestingness going on in terms of the Vincent bit. Given that we've seen that apparently one of the things Walt does is produce animals. So
yeah, main kind of thread that this sets up is the building of the raft going forwards.
Yeah, and this harps back to the two group ideas, and I think this really does create the two groups of trying to escape, trying to get rescued, versus the stay, let's make our lives more comfortable and safe side of things, because it's faced with that, with the notion of, we shouldn't be, I can't remember what he was complaining about, building water irrigation or any
of that. Because it's a turnaround from Michael, because Michael was the one that kind of designed and built their
whatever their water
panels.
And
it's him kind of looking at Walt and imagining Walt growing up on the island has made him go, hang on, no, we need to get out of here.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure it was Michael who effectively forced Walt to go to the caves in the first place. So it really is about to, Walt wanted to stay on the beach.
Yes, and I think it's Michael that is, and it's Michael also who kind of assesses the caves and confirms they're safe.
So I think that's a sort of a really interesting development, and it'll be interesting to see who joins Michael's raft building group, which I assume will form at some point.
Yeah. And I guess aside from that, you've got the détente between Locke and Michael. Obviously, they kind of start the episode at kind of, Michael starts being angry because he thinks Locke shouldn't be showing Walt to throw knives, which is probably a fair point.
It's like if someone wants to learn to throw knives, and you get that another hint in that interaction that there's something special about Walt, because you've got him picturing it in his mind's eye, and then suddenly he can throw a knife with deadly accuracy.
And I think Locke says to Boone, Walt is different, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think that he's the second character that sort of explicitly states, "Oh, you can." But I can't quite remember the line, but it was like you can tell he's different or something. And
I think during this, like, there are bits where you kind of think Michael maybe is overreacting a little bit, but I think that comes out of the fact that he doesn't really know what he's doing as a parent, because he's not.
Yeah, and that's something I think that's helpful, because up to this point he has just seemed like an overreacting person whenever Walt's gone to do something with Locke, because we've had that sort of Walt-Locke interaction running along for a few episodes now. And so this sort of plugs the gaps in terms of Michael's character, in terms of, okay, this makes sense because he's literally having to try and be a father for the first time, and he doesn't really know the kid, all the other bits and pieces associated with that. So yeah, it's one of those where it probably doesn't advance things too much, because but it does really sort of nail down, those two characters and the concept that there's something weird about Walt and some things that are going on around him, and it makes Michael's character fit in a lot better in terms of, now that we understand the backstory, his interactions both with Walt and the rest of the group about Walt.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think in terms of moving other things forward, you get one small thing and, like, obviously one huge thing, which we'll come on to in a second. So the smaller one actually comes out of Charlie kind of finally breaking and reading Claire's diary that he's found. And I do quite like that little moment where people are like, "You read it?" And he's like, "I'm a horrible person. Let's just move on."
Yeah, and I really liked, like, the way, I genuinely like that as a nice little subplot, in that. I'm trying to think how to describe. I liked Dominic Monaghan's acting.
Yeah.
Especially when he finally gets it, in particular when he sort of got the book and he sort of opens it, shuts it again, opens it, shuts it again, and he sort of puts it down and then, like, runs away from it, and all these other bits and pieces. And it's great having that sort of played out, because up to that point, he was very definitively, oh, I want to get the diary. And he clearly wanted to get the diary, we assume, in case it gave some kind of clue based on her dreams or the other bits and pieces in terms of trying to find her. And so it's kind of nice that he sort of has this idea and is very motivated. He has to face up to Sawyer and to go get it. And it's the great, oh, something's gone missing. Who do we think has got it? Oh, look, it's Sawyer again. Hi, Sawyer.
Yeah, I do quite like that thing as well, where Sawyer's like, oh, just because something's gone missing, you think it's me.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I've got it.
Yeah, you shouldn't be accusing me of all time. I mean, I definitely stole it this time round, but
Maybe next time I didn't, but I probably did. Anyway, so it's a diary. Charlie reads the diary.
Charlie reads the diary, and you get the realization that she likes him as well, which is kind of nice.
Yeah. And then in terms of like the mysteries, he finds the reference to the Black Rock.
Yeah.
Which is
that leads back to, because you've got a few scenes with Saeed doing the map thing.
Yeah, trying to work out the maps.
The map together. And I did write down the little angle triangle with the angles on. I was like, I wonder if I can figure out what this is about. I can't figure out what it's about, but it definitely seems like the sort of thing that looks like it might be important.
I like the little bit where it's like, and all the notations are sort of broken up, so I can't work them out. And then Shannon's like, apart from the song about the fish.
Yeah.
And I think that's a nice little moment, because that, like a few episodes ago, it was kind of implied that might be like, part of the mystery, but no, it's just clearly was stuck in Danielle's head or whatever, so she's written it out.
So that's the sort of other bit that sort of is sort of pushing things along. So I can't remember how many times we've heard about the Black Rock, but it's definitely become a thing that's been repeated a few times.
First time you hear it specifically mentioned is Danielle mentions it when she has Saeed.
Yeah. And there was a bit of me that was wondering, like, Black Rock, could this be some kind of, could that be the source of the magnetic anomaly that's causing the compass? Because it could be one of these ferrous metals deposits or something like that. There's definitely aspects of that you kind of go, oh, this is interesting, because this again, all those little strands of Danielle, the others all sort of seem to be pointing towards this Black Rock thing. And there's a bit of me that's like, does it fit in possibly with Locke's Hatch? Like, is Locke's Hatch on the Black Rock? Is that where they are and they know about it and the others don't know about it? Is it, or is it two completely separate things that's going on there?
Yeah. And I think then there's this little bit of information, isn't there? And it turns out like Danielle's maps, I think Saeed initially seems to think that Danielle's maps are like where the island is in terms of other things, but it's not. It's just maps of...
Yeah, which I have to say, I mean, that seemed like not a great assumption, because my assumption was they were going to be maps of the island rather than, because she's been shipwrecked on the island, and she presumably she has an idea of roughly where they are, at least a little bit better than
they do,
because these lot are thousands of miles off course because of the whole thing. She at least was in a boat, which they presumably had an idea where the boat was when they got there. But yeah, my assumption was they were maps of the island, which is why I thought he grabbed them. But
yeah. And then of course you have like your big moment right at the end with this one, where it's like, it's Claire just wandering around.
They're looking for Vincent and find Claire. And the interesting bit about this one, which is why I'm really keen to see the next episode, is I was like, I'm kind of convinced in my head that Claire is no longer pregnant. And you couldn't tell from how they shot it. So I'm like, want to see the next episode. I want to see if she's pregnant or not, because certainly the vibe with the whole Claire kidnapping thing was that it was more about the baby than it was about Claire.
Yeah.
And therefore, and given Claire was imminently supposed to be having the baby, that's what they were making a big deal about it in the episode where she goes missing. My sort of vibe was, oh, she's going to come back and they've got the baby, Ethan and co.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting. I'm going to be like, oh no, she's still pregnant. Probably going to be disappointed by that one, but it'd be interesting to see how that one pans out. But they very definitively shot it so you couldn't see.
Yeah, it's not clear. Yeah, all you get is, oh, it's Claire, and she looks a bit spaced.
Yeah. And I can't quite remember how long she's supposed to have been gone for, but it was like a few days at least, because Charlie references it. I can't quite remember.
One of those things where I think in Lost, it's always sometimes a bit hard to work out how much time it's supposed to have passed. I think it's either this episode or the episode before where somebody mentions might be this episode actually with Michael. Somebody mentions it's been about 6 weeks since they got there.
Right.
Overall, it maybe suggests like a week, maybe a week and a bit since Claire had gone.
Yeah, that was always kind of, a week or so seemed to be in the back of my head, because we've had, what is it, 2 episodes since you got grabbed, or was it 2 or 3?
Yeah, 2 episodes. And I think, and at one point, again, possibly this might be the previous episode where Charlie mentions he's been in heroin withdrawal for 2 weeks.
Right, yeah. So it definitely a good episode, because it gave you a nice cliffhanger at the end with sort of give you suggestions. It gave you a lot of pieces to the puzzle in terms of Michael. It really beefs up Walt as a possible additional supernatural force that's going on here. And you had some nice interactions with some of the other characters that was going on. And Locke gains yet another follower.
Locke's gang. And I think, the only other come up moment I noted down was you get the bit where Shannon obviously tries to kind of manipulate Boone into joining the raft building project, but now Boone has kind of moved beyond her ability to control him, and he's just like, nah.
It sort of follows on from the previous episode that now Boone is obsessed with Locke rather than Shannon. So
yeah, that's all Locke achieved. He just moved the obsession. He didn't finish it.
Yep. So if Locke needs 50 grand to bail him out from some relationships, then
maybe that's it's Locke's long con. And then the only other thing I kind of wrote down actually was just it wasn't the most convincing polar bear.
Right.
I think this is the first time where, like, I've mentioned it a couple of times before. Like, generally the show is just so well made and so well produced, and there's clearly a lot of money spent on it. This was the first time with that polar bear. There was like a few shots where it's just
it was blatantly a CG polar bear. But then, the way they shot it was to try and keep it out of sight. And I there's a bit of me that wonders if that was like deliberate to try and again make it more sus that Walt may have created it type thing, that it is possibly not a real. I think
part of that is initially that's all mixed in with you hear the noises, then you're like, oh, is it a boar or is it like the jungle monster? So I think it's partly that, obviously deliberately sort of keeping things initially anyway out of shot.
Yeah, but I definitely would agree with you that like the shots of the bear didn't look that convincing, but I wasn't sure if that was deliberate or just badly done. That was
Yeah, I think it's just badly. I think it's just one when they pushed it a bit too far. Pushed themselves.
Just need the man in the polar bear suit. It's always the better way of doing it.
Yeah. Grr. Yeah, and it turns out, all you need to do to make friends with the enemy is save a small boy from a polar bear.
Yep.
After that, Locke and Michael, best of buds.
Best of buds. In fact, the whole sequence where they rescue them was probably, thinking back on it, did feel a little bit cheaply done. Like, they had them sort of kind of walking across this branch thing. Yeah. It all felt a little bit, not quite to the same production value as the previous episodes. But, it worked. It did what it had to do. So,
so any final thoughts on episode 14 special?
I think that's covered off all the bits and pieces. I definitely say I enjoyed the episode and think it advanced a lot of things. There were some bits and pieces that we've talked about, like the characterization of Susan just didn't quite fit.
Yeah.
And as we've mentioned, the pull the bear thing was probably not as well done as it could have been. And so it's probably a good thing that even with those flaws, I sort of came away sort of satisfied with the episode and definitely wanting to watch the next one because of the way they done it. And I think we're sort of at an interesting point now where we start steadily getting more and more info on the characters. There's less mystery in the characters themselves and more mystery from all the things around it. Is how we're going.
Yeah, cool. So that was that episode. So join us next time for episode 15, which sees the return of Claire.
Claire has definitely returned.
Yeah, so we'll catch you next week. And as before, please do join in with your thoughts in the comments below.